If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the most mysterious / paranormal thing you've witnessed? My father passed away last year. One item he always said he wanted me to have was a shotgun which had originally belonged to his grandfather. For years he had this shotgun stashed in the attic. After he passed, I had gone in the attic to look for it, only to find that it wasn't there. A few months later, I had a dream in which I was talking to him and I asked him where he had put the shotgun. He told me it was in the closet of a spare bedroom. I called my mother and had her check, and sure enough that's where it was. Now it's completely possible that my father had told me that when he was alive, and the dream was little more than a memory, but I certainly don't recall that being the case. My mom told me this story the other day and it freaked me the fuck out. When my oldest sister was little, like 3, she asked my then pregnant aunt to pick her up to hold her. My mom said she was like, "She can't pick you up, honey, she has a baby in her tummy." And then my little sister was like, "That baby is dead." My mom freaked out, but my aunt and grandma were fine and were telling my mom it was all good, she was just a toddler and didn't know what she was saying. Well, lo and behold, my aunt goes to the doctor the next day for a routine pregnancy checkup and the baby was dead. Give me willies just thinking about it. Scariest moment of my life happened while my friend and I were camping in eastern Canada as teenagers. We decided to sleep in this abandoned camper we found deep in a large forest that was near our town. It had been there so long that small trees had grown around it. We'd stumbled across it when we were exploring a few months back and thought it would be cool, and brave, to sleep there for a night. So one weekend we did it. We arrived after dark because we had gotten lost trying to find the camper. We had a really low power flashlight, so it made it even more difficult. Once we finally found it, we opened the rusty door and stepped in. The sounds inside the camper were shrill and echoey. There were typical camper things strewn about: cups, empty cans, swollen Pulp Fiction novels. Already tired, we holed up in one end of the camper where the bed area had originally been before the cushions had rotted away to almost nothing. A long hallway stretched the length of the camper so we could basically see from end to end. It was a miserable night. There were several rats living in there. I saw them staring at us from a chewed out part of the ceiling. When the wind blew outside, the camper would shriek and groan. We even thought we heard a bear outside too, walking around. Still, we feigned bravery and acted like we were having a good time. But we were on edge. At some point I woke up from an uncomfortable sleep. I sat up to adjust myself when I noticed some movement out of the corner of my eye. At the other end of the camper, there was a small window, and as I looked at it I saw a man's silhouette. He was clearly staring straight at me from outside. At first I thought maybe it was a weird shape of a tree or something. But when I moved a bit to get a better look, the person clearly reacted and then froze. My heart was pumping and I woke up my friend immediately, saying someone is here over and over and over in a whisper, not taking my eyes off his profile. He woke up immediately and I nodded towards the window. He saw him too. We whispered frantically about who it could be and why was he staring at us. And for the next 10 minutes, no joke, we stared him down. The longer we stared at him, the more frightened we got. Occasionally he would move, but always keeping his eyes locked on us. Eventually I shouted at him, "Hey!" No reaction. My friend was braver than me and decided to shine the flashlight at him. As soon as he did, we realized our horrible mistake. It wasn't a window at all on the other side of the camper. It was a mirror. We had been staring down ourselves from the very start. Completely idiotic. Still, it was the most fearful, relieving and funny moment of my life that I'll never forget it. Closest to paranormal I've ever been. I saw a shadow person once. I didn't know that's what it was called until much later. I was living in a house in Laguna Beach that had been there since the 1920s. In its history, it had been a speakeasy, a brothel and a house for smuggling illegal immigrants. One day, my new wife and I were having an argument. I can't even recall what it was about. She walked down the block to get a cup of coffee and cool off, and I was alone in the house. The way the place was built was incredibly haphazard. There was a bedroom and living room on one side, then a bathroom with 2 entrances. On the other side of the bathroom was a hallway that had windows in one side and 2 bedrooms on the other. From my bedroom, I could look across the hall into the bathroom, then through the bathroom and down the other hall. I was standing at my dresser, and I just noticed movement out the corner of my eye, and looked down there. There was. And honest to God, this gives me goosebumps just typing it, 17 years later, a black figure. It was maybe 3 feet tall, and it was only vaguely humanoid. It looked like black scribbles, like someone had scribbled a human shape, but the scribbles moved, like electricity arcing, That's the best way to describe it. There was no sound that I could remember. I distinctly remember when I saw it I wasn't afraid, just like, WTF? Then it noticed me looking at it. I can't say it turned around, it just focused on me, I guess. Then I was scared. I didn't move, didn't scream, nothing, I was just frozen, because it just fucking came at me. It rushed down the hall towards me. I have no idea what it intended, but as soon as it entered the bathroom, the door closest to me just slammed shut on it. I screamed. I yelled for my wife. She wasn't home. I went the fuck outside, into the daylight, and didn't go back in until she got home about 10 minutes later. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe I saw something supernatural, but I know I saw something. I don't know what it was. My grandfather passed away just a few weeks after I was born. Never met the guy, never knew what he looked like. When I was 5 years old, I started to see this man in our rocking chair. I called him the rocking chair man. My parents thought it was that imaginary friend stage, but it started to bug them when I told them every single day. They finally questioned me about it. I told them every detail I could remember, and finally they showed me a picture of a man. It was my grandfather. To this day, I'm 22 now, every time I dream, he is in the background somewhere. I remember when I dreamed about my high school graduation and I looked in the stands and I saw him with my parents. I like to think that he's just watching out for me and being there when he's not really there. So I am a true believer of the paranormal. I attended the same university for my bachelor's and my PhD. There was a lovely woman by the name of Jennifer, who was my reading in the content area instructor. The guys all swooned over her. She was gorgeous, and I loved her because she read us The Giver out loud. She was an awesome instructor, and was doing her PhD in literacy. Fast forward a few years, and Jen has moved to South Carolina to teach literacy. I'm now in my PhD program, and in the same grad student office she used to work in, with other literacy people that were her colleagues. And then, we get the news that she was murdered by her boyfriend. Everyone is totally devastated. It was a huge blow to the department, as she was genuinely loved by everyone who knew her. So a few days after her funeral, her body was brought home. I'm in the office suite at school very early in the morning, when nobody else was around. The grad students had a fishbowl office, 10 of us, with group desks, within a larger office suite that was locked and had light motion sensors. I'm walking in and pass a locked door with windows, and I see a woman with short, dark hair walk the other way inside. Which was weird, because the lights didn't flicker on when she moved. So I walked around the corner to the door with a key code and let myself in. I walk inside, and head to where I saw her. The lights flicker on when they sense me. Nobody is there. It's just me, and an entire suite of empty offices. I swear to God, it was her, saying goodbye to a place she spent so many years, and where she had so many friends. It spooked the hell out of me, but made me sad, too. I grew up in the Arctic. In the town I lived in, as long as it was a clear night, it was an extremely normal occurrence to see all sorts of strange lights move across the sky. Keep in mind the winter is long in the Arctic, which means longer amounts of time being spent under the stars. It's quite beautiful, as long as you don't mind the cold so much. Sometimes I would drive a snowmobile a few kilometers out of town, shut it down, and just lay down on the snow looking up at the majesty of it all, the only thing disturbing the silence being the occasional breeze. The northern lights are also a common occurrence. Doesn't happen every day, but often enough that they start getting ignored after a while, as long as they aren't too spectacular anyway. On one particular night, without asking my parents, it was their snowmobile, I decided to go on one of my midnight drives out of town. I drove a few kilometers over the hills to find a spot devoid of light pollution from town, shut off the machine, and settled into a good spot to look up and be retrospective. It wasn't all that interesting a scene. A few satellites passing here and there, some relatively boring activity affecting the magnetic field, etc., and then I started noticing a clicking noise. At first I thought it was the sound of the snow machine cooling down, as engine expands and contracts a lot in the cold. But the source of the sound definitely wasn't coming from that direction. My next thought was there must be an animal nearby, in which case I need to get out of there fast. You don't really want to mess with a wild animal. But, the clicking is far too regular for an animal to produce it. It was fairly mechanical sounding. And again, the source of the sound isn't coming from anywhere around me laterally. It was coming from up. So naturally I look up, determined to ascertain the origin of this strange noise. I see what I always see: stars, northern lights, a lazy satellite crossing the sky, all normal stuff. But before I dismiss it altogether and begin heading home, I notice something strange in the aurora borealis. There were 3 rather strong points of light. I ignored them at first thinking they were oddly symmetrical stars, but this proved false. They were definitely getting brighter. I kept staring in morbid fascination as they grew stronger and stronger, yet still only remaining single points in the sky. All the while the clicking noise is getting louder and louder and more pronounced, almost like someone started with tapping a pen on a desk to clacking billiard balls together inside my head. Then it stops. The lights are gone, the clicking is not heard, and aside from being a little stiff, cold, and rather petrified, I'm fine. So I jump back on the snowmobile thinking maybe I'm going crazy. The machine takes a little longer than usual to start up, and I'm beginning to worry, but soon it's running and I'm heading back to town. As I'm driving back, several plausible scenarios as to what occurred are running through my head. I'm thinking it could have been a helicopter from the mine, or some strange Northern Lights behavior, etc. Probably not that big a deal. I pull up to my house. Lights are all dark. Strange. It wasn't that late when I left. Open outer door as quietly as possible. Remove winter gear, enter inner door. House is quiet. Really quiet. My parents are teachers and are usually up late marking or watching TV. All I'm thinking is I have to get to bed without anyone noticing. Proves to be easy as I'm soon under my covers. I go to set my alarm for the next day. All of the sudden everything makes sense. Engine hard to start, stiff, rather chilly, nobody up when I was gone what felt like relatively short period of time. It was almost 11 p.m. when I left, and now it was creeping up on 6 a.m. I stood, staring at clicking lights for almost 7 hours. I never ended up sleeping that night, and I don't go on late night snow machine rides anymore. A few years ago, my best friend and I moved into a rent house. It was definitely a weird house and I got some weird vibes out of it. Every night when I went to sleep, I would hear music. Not singing, just music, like someone had a distant radio on, and not any song I could ever name. I had dreams every night of a crowd of faceless people with a little boy standing in front. He never spoke, but I could tell he was trying to tell me something. The fridge would often open on its own and the cats would hiss at corners and such. We would smell cigarette smoke coming from the back room at 3 o'clock every day. My aunts were, still are, big into ghost hunting, so they set up cameras in my house one night. We didn't catch much, but one of the cameras was spun in circles for about 15 seconds and at 3 in the morning, the front porch light turned itself on and got really bright and then faded off. When I moved out of the house after 2 years, I had trouble sleeping because I didn't have the music anymore. It was definitely a strange house. My mom grew up in a rural part of Guatemala where witchcraft was a real thing and has so many stories of the weird shit she and her brothers and sisters experienced there. Of all the stories she tells, the creepiest one deals with a young apprentice to a witch doctor who traveled around the country healing people. He was murdered west of Guatemala City and they had arranged to bring his body back to be buried there. They paid bottom dollar to have some poor bastard go pick up the body and bring it back in his pickup truck. The guy gets there, loads the coffin on his truck and starts heading back, but his truck breaks down on the way. He gets out and frantically tries to get the truck back on the road, as he has to be back in time for the services to start. He is completely alone in the dark hours of the early morning and a man in a nice suit comes from out of nowhere to help him out. The man gets his truck back in working order and walks back down the road into the darkness. The guy gets the body back in time and after some prep, they begin the services. He happens to walk by the open coffin to pay his respects and sees that the dead man in the coffin is the very same man who had helped him with his truck. To this day, I get shivers thinking about it. I was in 7th grade and we'd just moved into a mill town house, one of the houses built close by a dam and textile mill that used to house the families of mill workers. The upstairs area always gave me an eerie feeling, but I shrugged it off as the discomfort of living in a new place. From the beginning I had trouble sleeping, and was jolted awake in the middle of the night repeatedly for no apparent reason. Then, I started hearing the thumping. It started as occasional, soft thumps, seemingly coming from the attic. I had my dad check it out to ease my mind, but he found no explanation. Fast forward a few weeks, the occasional knocking was becoming louder and I continued to wake up in the middle of the night. One night I was jolted awake again, but this time I heard a loud bang accompanied by the sound of breaking plastic. I looked to my window across the room, and the blinds had been completely torn and were in disarray. My door was closed, the windows were closed, and the house was locked up tight. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. I made it downstairs pretty quickly and the sound woke my parents, so they went upstairs to check it out. They found no cause or explanation. I slept on the couch downstairs until we moved shortly afterwards. An update to the original, my parents still live in a neighborhood not far from the house, And I've noticed that it never keeps an occupant for too long. Also, I never experienced anything similar until this year. I live in an apartment with 3 other people, and on occasions on which one of us has been home alone around 2 a.m., we've heard knocking sounds as if someone is at the door. In my roommate's experience, the knocking quit when she answered the front door. In my experience, the knocking stopped when I turned the lights on. It's pretty eerie. Several years ago in my hometown of Galveston, Texas, I took a job on a shrimp boat with a friend of mine. All I had to do is cook dinner and then handle a winch setting. I can barely remember that part of the job. An hour or more would go by before I was needed, so I flipped through a few magazines. One, a Reader's Digest, had a story about an actor from Canada who lived in Galveston around the turn of the century. He passed away and his family in Canada wanted him buried back in Canada, but couldn't afford to send his body home again. So, he was buried in Galveston. Years later, a hurricane struck and decimated 2/3 of Galveston with powerful flooding. 4 or 5 years go by, and the actor's casket washed up in his hometown in Canada. Apparently the flood waters had washed his coffin out to sea, where it eventually floated home. When I was young, I'd have a reoccurring dream. The dream had no real story behind it, it was just odd little clips of my life so far. The dream always ended the same way. It would just kind of fade to black and I'd hear voices. One saying I just had the weirdest dream. And a female voice would reply, "What about?" The first voice would then go on talking, and at that point I'd wake up. So about 8 months ago, at least 30 years later, I had the dream again. It was the weirdest thing. I could remember all those little clips, most of which I had long since forgot about. I felt this overwhelming joy to be recalling all those lost childhood memories. The feeling was so intense, it was like being so happy I could cry, never felt that before. But the end of the dream was different this time. And this is the God's honest truth. Instead of fading to black and hearing the voices, I just woke up. I was laying there feeling confused about the dream. Was this the same dream I'd had when I was little? I rustled my wife from her sleep and said I just had the weirdest dream. She replied, "What about?" I was wide awake, playing out the ending of the childhood dream. No shit, everything I said to her over the next minute or two to describe the dream was actually as I had heard it when having the dream back when I was 8 or 10. It was like this hardcore case of deja vu. I have deja vu from time to time and I think it's cool, but this blew my mind. The next morning after the dream, and I was already starting to question myself about whether I actually had those dreams when I was young, or was it something my dream invented? But if I did have them, was I somehow peering into the future? I'm all about logic and science. I don't believe in ghosts, the supernatural, or even God for that matter. Sorry, Mom. I believe there's an answer for everything, but I'll be damned I have an inkling to what this was about. Whenever I was scared as a kid, my dad had always told me that in life, you should not be scared of ghosts, fear the living because they can actually hurt you. In my late teenage years, I came into some money after my father committed suicide and I received an inheritance from him. At time of my dad's passing, he and my mom owned a cabin up in Oregon by Mount Bachelor. The cabin had been put up for sale since my mom could no longer afford the payments, and renting it out was not covering the payments either. The cabin was set to go on the market for sale in less than a month and was in the process of finalizing all the paperwork with the realtor and lawyer. So for that month's time, the cabin was not going to be rented out any longer and was going to be vacant. I saw this as a chance to get away for a while and clear my head in light of all the things going on. I quit work, packed up my snowboarding gear, grabbed my dog and headed up in my dad's car that he had willed to me, to the cabin. Now this was our family cabin that my parents rented out throughout the year when we were not using it. I had keys to the cabin and also had the code for the alarm, so I did not feel the need to stop at the rental management company and advise them of my stay. This has nothing to do with the coming story, but felt the need to mention it anyway. My first 2 days at the cabin were normal and nothing out of the unusual happened. Spent my days playing with my dog in the snow, snowboarding, and the evenings playing PlayStation or listening to music, drinking and smoking out on the balcony. Had already stocked up on food, cigarettes and liquor, so I was pretty much a shut-in aside from the occasional out to hit the slopes. With my dog as company and DVDs/PlayStation as entertainment, I was quite content and started to feel relaxed after all the drama that had preceded my outing. The cabin itself was 2 stories, bottom story had the living room and a side guest bedroom along with small kitchen. Upstairs had another 2 rooms along with a walkout balcony attached to the master bedroom. Most of my time there was spent either in the living room, kitchen or master bedroom. I never ventured into the other rooms and always kept the doors leading into them shut. Open doors to dark rooms always creeped me out. Anyhow, the 3rd day came around and I was going through my usual routine of playing with my dog, His name was Midnight, by the way, and he also since passed, playing games and watching DVDs. That day it was pretty heavy snowfall, so I did not feel like trekking down the hill to the main road in my car and decided to stay in. That's when things started getting a bit weird. In our area there were only 2 other cabins adjacent to ours, maybe a block away from each other. All other cabins aside from these 2 were around a mile away from ours. Surrounding us was mostly forest and very tall pine trees tall. This is important later on. Both these cabins were empty, and from the past couple of days I knew that no one was currently staying there. Gave enough background and I'm going to jump to the weirdness. Around midday while outside with my dog I noticed what looked like footprints in the snow around the area surrounding our cabin. It was still snowing, so the footprints looked semi-fresh, like someone had been there in the last 20 to 30 minutes before me. I thought that maybe someone was staying in the cabin near me that I may not have noticed, maybe they were shut-ins like me. Alright, whatever. The prints lead away from my cabin and it disappeared in the snow towards the denser part of the trees. Disregarded the footprints and went back inside. Nighttime came around and decided to head to bed. My dog Midnight was laying on the bed with me when I noticed his ears perk up to a standstill/listening position. This was followed by him quickly jumping off the bed and running downstairs to the living room. I lay in bed and stayed silent. I was kind of freaked out, and could hear him moving around downstairs back and forth. After around 5 minutes he ran back upstairs to me and started to do his doggy dance for the sign that he had to pee or that he wanted to go outside. Shit, well fine. I can't say no to him, so we both went downstairs to the outside driveway for him to do his thing. Only, he didn't want to pee. As soon as we were outside he started to pull on his leash, trying to drag me to where he wanted to go. He kept looking into the dense part of the trees where the prints had been earlier. But he also kept sniffing the side of the house and looking up towards the roof. After he figured out that I was not going to go to where he wanted, he sat himself down and just stared into the darkness. A bit unusual for him, but alright, maybe there are forest animals out there that he wants to chase down. Did not want to chance anything, so I pulled him back inside and we both headed back upstairs. Around half an hour later I was lying in bed when I heard what sounded like hooves walking on my roof. It was only a series of around 6 steps, and I rationalized that it could be a pine cone falling from a tree onto the roof, or maybe a kind-hearted forest animal running around. But here's the thing, the steps seemed to be spaced apart like a man-length stride. So it was really freaking me out. Midnight also heard the noise and was quick to run to the balcony screen door, expecting for me to let him out. Alright, you know what, I'm a tough guy and at the time considered myself to be fairly well built and strong enough to handle myself, so I grabbed my coat and shoes along with my cigarettes and flashlight and went out onto the balcony. As soon as I was outside I lit up my cigarette and started canvassing the roof with my light. Nothing there, and the snow on top was undisturbed. Weird, must have been all my head. What about Midnight hearing the noise? Maybe he was feeding off my fear or paranoia. I started to calm down and relax again. By the way, I am shaking right now and my heart is beating hard as I am typing this next bit. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness and I kept smoking and just staring at the stars and trees next to our cabin. That's when I saw it. In a tree that was a little taller than our cabin and around 20 feet from the balcony, I saw what looked like a man crouched in a squatting position in between 2 branches. It was squatted on one branch and its arms were extended above its head, holding onto the branch above it. What is that? I wasn't sure if I was really seeing this thing and stood just staring and sat there motionless. I noticed Midnight stand up and start pacing behind me and lightly barking at the same time. The thing still did not move. I put my cigarette out and was debating on shining the light in the thing's direction, but something in my head kept screaming not to. So I walked backwards to the inside of the room and pulled Midnight with me. Once inside I locked the door and shined the light in the thing's direction, but there was nothing there. I shut the curtains to the screen door and retreated back to bed. But later on in the night I heard light tapping at the screen door, like someone was tapping on the glass with their fingers. It was consistent and did not stop for nearly an hour. Midnight seemed to stare at the door, but he wouldn't go near it anymore. The weirdest part was that I had a feeling like someone was inviting me to open the door. But at the same time I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head telling me to stay in bed and not do it. I listened to my dad's voice and just stayed where I was. Passed out eventually and woke up in the morning and everything was normal. The rest of week I spent there was non-eventful and nothing else out of the ordinary happened. I totally admit that it could have been all in my head. A lot of stuff was going on at the time, so I was pretty from all the drama. I was driving home with my then girlfriend from a beach up north of us and it was around 10 p.m. We are on a deserted country road and I'm doing about 110 as I just wanted to get home. She was mostly asleep in the passenger seat and I had the radio off and was listening to the engine purr, We had about 25 miles before our turn, so I was just watching the edge of my headlights for deer and stuff when I saw tail lights appear from an intersection like someone had turned the flip their brake lights on. I started slowing down and my GF woke up from the speed change. The next thing either of us remember is a police officer knocking on my window waking us up. It's 3 in the morning in the intersection. I saw the lights. It is no more than a half mile down the road behind us. He asked us what we were doing and neither of us could come up with a good response, so he told us to keep going as we were pretty hard to see off to the side of the road. When we lived in our last apartment, my wife swore there was a ghost in our kitchen. I never saw anything personally, but she says she felt its presence. I had one, and only one strange experience in the 4 years we lived in that place. One day I was sitting in the living room playing some Xbox when all of a sudden the controller died. I thought it was weird because I had recently changed the batteries. I grabbed the other spare controller, and that one was dead, too. I grabbed the receiver remote to turn down the volume, and that remote was dead, too. Same with the TV and Fios remotes. I grabbed my laptop, which I had recently charged, and it was also dead. So I grabbed my cell phone to text my wife that something weird had happened. It was also totally discharged. Naturally, my wife blamed the kitchen ghost. I'm more skeptical than that, but I've never heard a better explanation for the simultaneous power drain in all my battery-powered devices, so I'm willing to chalk it up to a paranormal experience. The last time I posted this, someone said it could have been an EMP, but wouldn't that have disabled all electronics rather than just draining batteries? I am probably late to this thread, but I witnessed something very strange while I was living in Africa. I used to live in Zimbabwe until I was about 9 years old, and one day at school we had gym class outside. It was a normal swimming lesson, and nothing out of the usual happened. It was pretty much an average swimming class. After the class was over, I spent a while longer in the showers, and for whatever reason, I was the last person to leave the pool area. On my way out, I saw a couple of things fly past me at a fast speed. At first glance I thought it was just a pair of dragonflies playing around in the air. They flew back towards me, and I noticed that they were considerably larger than a normal dragonfly. What I saw, and I swear on my life, was 2 lizard-like creatures, with dragonfly wings. About the size of a dove, or a medium-sized bird. They flew around the pool for a couple of minutes, playing with each other in the air, and then suddenly, they flew off, and were gone. I drew pictures of the creatures, showed them to teachers, parents, and an uncle who is a biologist. Nobody had seen or heard of these creatures, and nobody believed me. I still wonder what kind of creatures they were. Me and some buddies were bored one night and decided to head out and poke around an abandoned mental hospital. The only way in was through the autopsy room, the rest of the place was pretty much sealed off. So we go in, me, another guy, and 2 girls. As soon as we get into the autopsy room, one of the girls starts hyperventilating and crying. She said she just couldn't be there anymore. We tried everything we could to convince her everything was going to be fine, to no avail. She wanted to leave, and wanted to leave now. Disappointed, we decided we had to leave. The 2 girls were walking in front of us, one trying to comfort the other, while me and the other dude walked a bit of a way behind. I don't know what brought me to look back, morbid curiosity maybe. But I did. Now, I'll admit it was dark, but the moon was out so it wasn't pitch black. Still, I know what I seen. A window on the 2nd floor, what looked just like a little girl in a white dress staring back at us. I looked for a good 10 seconds, stopped my buddy and had him look without taking my eyes off the thing, and asked him specifically, "Do you fucking see that?" I thought I may have been seeing things, or maybe it was a trick of the light. But no, we both saw it and stared for a good 20 seconds after. I might have thought it was some kind of trick, but after 20 seconds or so, it moved. We noped the fuck out of there, passing the girls and screaming at them to get in the car. Is it possible it could have been some other people there, who happened to bring a girl who might have looked from a distance to be a lot younger than she was? Yes. There were no other cars around though, so whoever it was would have had to walk a pretty good distance to get there. It could have also been a homeless family that was using the place for warmth. Who knows? All I know is what I saw. It was a little girl, in a white dress, staring at us. From the 2nd-story window of an abandoned mental joint. At 2 in the goddamn morning. I never believed in paranormal stuff and still don't, but about 3 years ago something happened to me and my wife that we still cannot explain. Since when I was a teenager I have problems waking up in the morning. Maybe it is because my sleeping schedule is off, maybe I just have a very deep sleep. Getting me to wake up really takes some effort. So one Christmas my grandmother gave me a radio alarm as a present, because I kept ignoring my ringing alarm constantly. And she gave me a good piece of advice: if you really need to wake up, just turn the wheel to select the radio station to the far left and the volume all the way up. This is what I did on all important occasions, and it really worked like a charm. There is no way I could overhear the whispering, irritating noise of static at full volume. Unfortunately, my grandmother died a few years after. Fast forward to a point 3 years ago. It had been a hard week for both me and my wife, and we were sound asleep on a Friday night, when suddenly the radio alarm went off, in the middle of the night. This did not wake me up, but my wife did, because she could not make it stop. The alarm was set to off and it still kept going. I tried everything and after 10 minutes managed to somehow make it stop. We went back to sleep, but after about 15 minutes the radio started to play again. I must have hit the snooze button. There was no way to shut the alarm up, so I cussed and swore and just pulled the plug. Back to sleep. My wife and I almost jumped out of our bed when the alarm went off again, screeching, yelling and whistling static at full volume. It is hard to describe the feeling, somewhere between panic, confusion and adrenaline flowing through you. I know I pulled the plug. I saw that no lights were blinking, no clock, just the black radio alarm. My wife panicked and ran out of the room while I kept staring at the alarm, unable to do anything but be scared. Then all of a sudden it went quiet, and through the silence I heard the muffled sound of our telephone, barely audible from the living room. I went to find it and found it stuck between the couch and a large pillow. The number calling was my mother's. It turned out that my mother had been home alone when she fell on the way back from the bathroom to her bedroom and broke her hip. Unable to move, she lay there helpless and desperately tried to call someone for help with her mobile phone that had been in her bath cloak. Had the radio alarm not woke us up, we would have gone on a weekend trip the next morning. This is the creepiest, most paranormal thing I have ever witnessed. So, a friend and I are at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery late one night when out of the blue I get a call from my mom and she starts screaming at me to stop messing around and what you did is not funny. When I finally got her to stop yelling and I tell her what she is accusing me of cannot be possible because I am several towns away in Sleepy Hollow, she goes completely silent. So, my friend and I drive to my house to talk to my mom and stepfather about what has happened. Apparently while I was out with my friend, someone was at my mom and stepdad's bedroom door and knocked extremely hard, and in my voice said, "Mom. M.A." with a frustrated tone to it. My mom and stepfather were sleeping, so it took a few seconds to answer. After they heard that first knock and voice, she answered, "What? Come in, what is wrong?" Then in my voice again, "Ma." And the door started violently shaking against the panel. Is it called, but never opened, then suddenly stopped. My stepdad thought something was really wrong and that I was hurt, so he jumped up and opened the door and no one was there. No one but us lived in the house, so they thought I was playing a joke on them until my mom called me and I told her where I was. Still have no clue what happened or why this thing took my voice and why it was calling out to my mom in such a frustrated voice. When we all tell stories, we add flourish, flash, hyperbole, and enthusiasm in an attempt to make the story memorable. My dad is not one of those people. He is honest and candid and gives little regard to whether it comes off as rude or not. In fact, him and I don't get along and we haven't spoken for nearly a year. Once, however, he did tell me something very strange. He is now a ship inspector, but he used to be a ship captain on a large cargo vessel. He told me once, during the twilight hour while he was out on voyage, standing on the bridge with his chief engineer, he saw 3 lights, in a triangular shape, approaching his ship at very high speed. As the 3 lights approached, he realized that if they were all of one vessel, it would be huge. His ship was easily encompassed within the area of the triangular lights for the brief second it passed under the ship, then on into the horizon. He, his chief engineer, and various other sailors all saw it, and all were at a total and complete loss as to what it could have been. He told me that was only just his first encounter with mysterious undersea craft. He didn't really elaborate afterwards, and I never thought to ask him. Like I said earlier, my dad doesn't really BS or flourish stories like most of us do, and when he tells me stories like that I tend to believe them. Back in 2007, my grandpa finally lost his 20-year battle with leukemia. My grandma couldn't manage well, being alone in the house they'd lived in for almost 60 years. We moved my grandma into an assisted living residence a few months later, and for insurance reasons, vacant property, my parents asked me if I'd like to move into the house so that I could watch the house, and also to move out and not live at home. I said absolutely. I remember right after he passed away, strange things started happening. The portrait we had of him in the living room fell off its hook. Picture frames containing pictures of him flipped onto their front during the night. I didn't mind though, because I thought my grandma was making it up. Before I moved in, my family got a big dumpster so we could clean some of the clutter out of the house. Since we'd spend most of the day cleaning and it was summer, we'd bring the family dog with us. My grandpa loved our dog dearly. But since he passed, my dog wouldn't go down to the basement anymore, where my grandpa spent most of his time in his office. She refused to go into the basement at all, and barked at the stairway a few times. This was weird, since our dog almost never barked. It finally made me think he's here. I moved in shortly after. While I lived there, things went missing all the time. I had bought a new lock set to change the back door lock, brought it home and put it in the cupboard to tackle on the weekend. Few days later I go to change the lock, and it's gone. After a week of looking around I finally found it in the trunk of my uncle's old BMW 2002 which he stored in the garage. I happened to be looking at the car. My grandpa was always a prankster, so I almost came to expect these occurrences. He used to wake up at 5:30 every morning to listen to the early news on the radio in the kitchen. I'd wake up some mornings and the radio would be on. I often heard typewriter noises coming from his office in the basement. It became comforting. I found myself talking to my grandpa out loud, having conversations with him. I missed him. After about 6 months, suddenly I wasn't hearing any noises anymore. Nothing was going missing. The radio wasn't turning on at 5:30. I shrugged it off for a few days, but it started to worry me. I went back to my parents and grabbed the dog, brought her back. She was apprehensive at first, but she entered the house. There was an issue though. Every time she'd been over since my grandpa died, as I mentioned earlier, she refused to go downstairs. This time though, she went downstairs, and went right to his office. Nothing was any different about the office, but she wasn't barking. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't doing anything. That was when I realized he was gone. I broke down. Suddenly I felt incredibly alone. Even though it had been about 8 months since he died, it was the first time I felt like he was gone. One night, when I was driving home from work, I pulled up to a stoplight where people were standing outside of their cars pointing up to the sky. I looked across the street to see more of the same. People stopped at a green light looking up. I realized that police officers were among the onlookers, so I thought, what the hell would spook a cop? As I got out of my truck, I saw something as big as an airport moving slowly over South Mountain. It was black and opaque, darker than the night sky which is bathed in the orange barf glow of Phoenix's sodium vapor street lights. Whatever it was solid, triangular and silent. On the edges it had gold-colored spheres that weren't like lights, but were glowing, if that makes sense. They even sequenced on and off, and I was immediately angry at myself for not even believing what I was seeing. I didn't want to see it, whatever it was, because I couldn't describe it and didn't have a camera to document it. This was 1997, way before smartphones. I got back in my truck, turned right and saw more witnesses trying to film it or take pictures. I remember hoping that somebody would get at least one good shot. The next day, these Phoenix lights were on the front page of every newspaper. Then, it was featured internationally and footage was broadcast around the world. There were literally thousands of witnesses. The thing moved up and down the entire state of Arizona, circling Phoenix and going around the Indian reservations, too. Airports, air bases, police, military, doctors, lawyers, every segment of the population you could think of, documented the event. And then, the strangest thing happened, absolutely nothing. It just sort of became old news, passé, everybody collectively got in their trucks and drove away to go home and sleep it off. There's a documentary about it, but to this day it's weird even talking about it because of the fact that people look at you like you're crazy. Even when an entire city shared in the phenomenon. I saw a very distinctive creepy creature enter and leave my room. My parents thought I was dreaming, until 4 years later policemen were attacked by the exact same thing on a nearby town and it made national news. Alright. I was 7 and shared a room with my sister. It was about 1 a.m. and I couldn't sleep. So I was just staring at the wall when I see something move by the door. Someone is coming in very slowly. And it's dark, so it takes some time for me to realize who it is. It's a woman, with a big pointy hat. I think it's my cousin, who lived with us, but she isn't that short. The only way it would be her is if she was walking on her knees. As I look down to see if that's the case, I realize she is not touching the floor at all. And even though I can tell she has an old woman's face, that is definitely not a human's face. Her eyes are too big and she's expressionless. She is very slowly heading and turning to where my sister is sleeping. And I'm just trying not to move at all. She reaches her bed and only stands there looking down at her. And then I move and make a sound. And the thing turns her head to me just like that. Her huge eyes are making eye contact with me for a second, and the next thing I know is she just went out the room almost flying, really fucking fast. After that I covered myself with the blanket. So I tell my parents the next day and obviously they don't believe me. A midget woman with a pointy hat, huge eyes and a dress floating in my room is too random. So after some years I start thinking I was maybe dreaming or something. Fast forward 4 years and in the news there is a cop who was attacked by a witch in a city 3 hours away from where I live. He saw something coming from the sky floating and landing on the roof of the car he was in. Then it tried to get in through the window and started to scratch him, pull him. He ended up passing out. And in the interview he says, she was dressed in black and had big eyes, dark skin and had a pointy hat. She was flying on its own. They show the drawings they make when the victim describes what they saw, and it was the same exact thing I saw. They also have sighting in 2010 by another cop, and the descriptions match too. He also mentions it had superhuman speed. And obviously a bunch of people started to fake related stuff since the news got relatively big. This happened in Mexico BTW. After I saw the news, I couldn't sleep well for a week. In fact, I have to admit I had to sleep with my parents a couple of times. For a reference, it looks sort of like the Flatwoods Monster. I was hitchhiking across the country. This one night, I was trying to get the hell out of Colorado, long story, and it was stormy as shit. It was cold and wet, and I hadn't seen a car for at least half an hour. It was raining so hard I could only see a few feet ahead. Out of nowhere, this car stops beside me. I hopped in and went to thank the driver, only to realize that there wasn't a driver in the car at all. Then the car started moving very slowly. There was a curve ahead. I thought for sure the car was going to run off the edge of a cliff. I was in full-on panic mode and I couldn't move. I damn near shit myself. Then, just before the car hits the safety rail, a hand appeared from the window and turned the wheel. This happened a few more times before I got my shit together and took the opportunity to escape. I booked it, full on adrenaline rush. Before I knew it, I was at a gas station on the edge of some dinky town. I was soaking wet and freaked the fuck out. I started to tell the guy at the gas station what just happened. He hooked me up with some hot coffee and we swapped stories for a little while. That's when, from the haze of the rainstorm, I see 3 guys walking up to the cashier. One of them says to the other, "Look, it's the weirdo that jumped in the car while we were pushing it." This may seem like it's fake, but what I'm about to say is 100% true. When my mother was young, she was very sick and needed medicine. Not all people, in the area we lived, liked Native Americans, which we are, so we relied on a local medicine man. Years later, we discovered that the medicine she was getting wasn't helping her anymore because she wasn't sick, she was haunted. She remembers seeing a demonic figure when she was younger, but at the time, she didn't know if it was real or not. This happened from when she could start to remember things up to when she was about 5. Well, 30 years later, that demonic figure started showing up again. But I know she wasn't just imagining it, because I could see it, hear it, and sometimes even feel something, like some sign of its presence. She started having nightmares, and we all knew what was happening. We decided to move back to our reserve to see if the problem or haunting was with the house, but it wasn't. No matter where she went, this thing followed her and us. I'll be honest, for a very long time, I thought she was basically faking it, until one night. My mom used to cope with this haunting by drinking tea and coloring. This night, she was coping in the living room, and nothing seemed to be happening, so none of us expected that anything would happen. Suddenly, we heard screaming in the living room coming from my mom, and we all ran to see what was wrong. She was crying and screaming that something was scratching her back. I didn't believe her until I lifted the back of her shirt and saw it with my own eyes. She was being scratched. There weren't just scratches already there, but scratch marks kept appearing as I watched, big, long, and red, over and over. I was terrified. I ran to grab some sweetgrass, and I was across the house when I heard the door open. It turns out my mom was walking towards the lake. Keep in mind that it's a Canadian winter, so it was about -35, not sure if F or C, but they'd actually be very close in this case, when she walked outside, barefoot and wearing nothing but her pajamas. After it happened, she didn't remember it, and to this day doesn't remember that night, but I still remember everything. We're afraid that it's starting to happen again. She is having brutal nightmares, and the entire family is starting to see black shadow figures. Another terrifying sign of this, we have a cat, and from time to time we'll notice it staring at a fixed point as if it is looking at someone or something, then it'll run away as if it's scared. I bought a house from a professor who had died 4 years earlier. I am a professor too. I teach graphics, he taught photography. When we bought the house, full of his stuff, he was a bit of a hoarder. We had a garage sale to clear it out. A woman we didn't know came in and said there was a ghost of an old woman in the house who was very happy that there would soon be children in the house. My wife got pregnant in the house within a week of the move-in. The really weird one was that I taught a class for a local university, other than the one I taught for primarily, and the office they assigned me was one that was named for the guy who I bought my house from. The other odd one was that the brother of the guy we bought it from mailed us a letter about the house, and then he died in a car accident before we received the letter. He had a heart attack, but his wife had Alzheimer's, so he tried to drive himself to the hospital and killed them both. My kids would constantly check out a book from the library called A Ghost Named Fred, which was his name. The weirdest part of it all though was that one time I was stretching a canvas in my basement and was planning on using wood and screws to hold the corners together. When I was on the basement floor I looked to my right and there was a box of the metal slats that professionals use to do this. I am not superstitious at all, and totally chalk these up to coincidence, but if I was superstitious it would have really freaked me out. Creepiest shit that's ever happened to me was senior year of high school. At the time me and my siblings couldn't stand being in the same room, and the same with my mom. Everyone was always arguing and my brothers and I were constantly getting into fist fights with each other. Anyways, I came home one night and was walking to my room in the dark. Earlier that day I had cleaned out my binder and left all the papers on my floor because I was going to be late for practice. My room is opposite to everyone else's and is right by the garage. I have a row of 4 windows in my room, and when my neighbors would have their backlight on I could see the silhouettes of everything in my room. Because of the placements of my windows I never get a breeze in my room, plus the windows were closed. So, was walking down the hallway to my room, in the dark it was about 10 p.m., when I heard the papers moving and it sounded like something was walking around on them. I was looking down at the floor when I decided to look up and see what was going on. I saw some sort of black thing crawling on my floor with its legs overly extended, and it seemed to have rough scales. I stopped dead in my tracks and it looked up at me. I booked it to my mom's room, slept with my mom that night. Told my mom the next day. She isn't the skeptical type, so she believed me and blessed the house with holy water that day. And little by little everything started changing for the better. I later found out she even put some holy water in our drinking water. In all honesty, I've always been extremely skeptical, but this experience changed that. My friend's family moved into one of the first houses ever built in our hometown. The house was originally owned by a very rich family that helped settle our town in the mid-1800s. During the Great Depression, the remaining family members ended up selling the house to someone who wanted to turn the house into apartments. The house remained split up as apartments for decades, and in the 50s, a young boy drowned in one of the bathtubs in his family's apartment. Shortly after my friend's family moved into the house, we started to notice strange noises while we were working on clearing out old debris, etc. It sounded like little kids running around. If you ever lived in an apartment below children, you know this sound. We attributed it to probable vermin in the front of the house. After about 6 months of working on the house, we had to close off the front part of the house because winter had arrived. Most all of the work on the house was at a standstill. It was during this time that we started to notice what sounded like a child singing. It happened almost every day, and after a while, we started trying to track down the sound. Eventually we were able to pinpoint that the sound was coming from a long crawl space near the bathroom that would have been between apartments if they still existed. Unfortunately, no one could fit in the crawl space, and when we resumed work on the house, the sound stopped. So when I was about 2 years old, grandmother had died/dying of breast cancer. Therefore my mom had started working and seeing her at the hospital daily, so my mom left me in the care of her cousins who had just moved into a new house. The day my sister took me to my Aunt Gloria's house, I was screaming and kicking not to go into the house. I was throwing such a tantrum that my brother began to fear going into the house as well. They eventually got me inside. About a week I was there, my brother started noticing a difference in me. He noticed I was talking much and I only stayed in the living room. My aunt noticed it too, and since I was actually very hyper, she began to get worried because I always had a look of confusion or pain on my face. Also, it was known that I was a very social and loud child, so it really did confuse everyone as to the mood change in the house. Although no one still told my mom. Eventually she caught on though. My aunt had a daughter who graduated at the time and they were throwing a party for her. That's when my mom noticed that I was talking to spirits. She caught me sitting in the living room, talking clear English to the fireplace, and this was strange because most kids at the age of 2 cannot form clear sentences sometimes, and I had a stutter, still do, so my mom asked me, "Who are you talking to?" To which I replied, "The baby in the fireplace." My mom got curious, did her research and found out that a family lived there years before my aunt did. There was a lot of domestic violence, and the father threw the newborn child into the fireplace and killed his wife and 3 daughters. The father had also burned the house down and ran off. Years later, a priest bought the land and wanted to rebuild the house, and for unknowingly reasons was run over by a vacant tractor. Weird, huh? I was a missionary and talking to one of the members of my church who asked if we could do an exorcism. I raised an eyebrow and asked what the conditions were. She owned a motel near the edge of the small town that was quite popular, as it was the only motel for miles around. She had a man rent a room for just the night, asking for a wake-up call around 8 a.m. He seemed agitated and upset, but she figured he might just be stressed from a long drive and so rented the room out to him, and that was that. The next morning, she made the courtesy call, but no answer. He didn't check out either, so she booked the room for another day, as this is a common occurrence in motels. But later that night, nobody had exited the room, so she became concerned. She took the master key and opened the door, immediately wishing she hadn't. The man had killed himself by stabbing himself multiple times in the gut. However, he missed all of his vital organs and so instead bled out painfully and slowly. But during this agonizing pain, he decided to crawl all over the room, leaving blood trails everywhere. She called the police and got the place cleaned up. She kept this quiet with the rest of the staff, as the police said the whole thing was under investigation, and later reopened the room months later. Whenever she rented out the room, the people would always tell her that the TV was broken. During the night, they would always hear weird sounds coming from the TV, but the TV was not on. One family even unplugged the cord, but the sounds kept coming, so they assumed it was mechanical. The maids also refused to clean the room alone. They said that when they were in the room alone, they felt strange and weird, as if some dark presence was watching them from, you guessed it, behind the TV stand. So she finally decided to ask us missionaries to do an exorcism. She was visibly very spooked. I agreed as the group leader to perform the exorcism that following Sunday, much to the chagrin of the other missionaries, who knew that my time as a missionary was up and would be leaving before the end of the week. I saw some crazy stuff as a missionary, and I don't even believe in demonic possessions or evil spirits. This isn't even the half of it. Some backstory: I and my sister grew up in our grandmother's house. A quiet neighborhood in Oxnard, California, in very close proximity to the Chinese railroad worker grave sites. We were surrounded by farms and fields, back in the day, and some of our neighbors even rode horses down the block on occasion. It was a quiet, simple, peaceful little place. Absolutely nothing was out of place or outwardly strange. Everything was always very normal. Any road, around the age of 5, my sister and me are tucked into bed and, as all children do, we whispered about our day until we eventually fell asleep. Late in the night, when all of the adults had retired to their beds and all of the house lights were out, I woke and turned to see a red brick wall splitting our bedroom in half. Now, I slept on the half of the room in my bed where there was no door. So, I sat up and physically moved out of my bed to literally feel this red brick wall. It was a cold night, and I remember feeling that distinct texture of rough brick, cold and solid beneath my fingers. Needless to say, I had a child's instinct to panic. I began to scream, and cry out for my mom and for my grandmother. I cried and banged my fists against the bricks, calling out my sister's name. Nobody replied. To this day, I remember the soreness of my hands, and it felt like I'd been slamming my fists and palms on stone for ages. I cried and cried. I remember screaming until my throat was raw. Suddenly, from the outside of the wall, a small hand appeared. Now this is really important, because it frightened me and it calmed me all at once. This hand, small, like mine, literally melted through the bricks that I'd been pounding and screaming against. It was like seeing a Dalí painting come to life. I remember sucking my breath in and trying not to breathe. Tears, which had been cold in the corners of my eyes, fell warm and thick and new. The wall was moving like it was a fabric, and it was clear that something or someone was trying to get through the wall at very specific points. Wordlessly, I crawled into bed and did what every intelligent child does. I covered myself, toe to head, with my blankets and pillows and stuffed animals, before finally crying myself to sleep. I kept thinking, and praying, that someone was eventually going to come save me before I was permanently trapped. Still, nobody came, and I must have tired myself out and drifted into a very sad, uneasy sleep. The next morning, when I awoke, I was covered over by every pillow, stuffed animal, and blanket on my bed. I had constructed a small wall of bed things between me and the brick wall. However, now that the morning had come, that red brick wall was gone. I sat up and ran to my little sister's bed. Without hesitation, she sat up and said to me, "I just had the weirdest, scariest dream." I stared back at her, my heart skipping a few beats, and asked, "Did it have a red brick wall?" She turned pale, even her lips were sickly looking, and she started to cry. We've talked about it off and on for years, and eventually she told me that experience is still so frightening for her, she doesn't like to talk about it with anybody. It still terrifies her to remember how vividly that wall was constructed between our beds in the middle of our room. Distinct red brick, extremely solid on my end, and absolutely soundproof from my perspective. Still, I asked her if she could hear me when I was screaming through to her, and she said, "I could hear you. And when I tried to reach you, my arm went through the wall." I screamed for mom or grandma because I thought I was stuck, but when nobody came, I was able to pull my hand back through. I tried to get you out, but the wall wouldn't give. This experience, besides being absolutely terrifying and inexplicable, left me with a very sore throat, exhaustion, and even chafed hands the next morning. All in all, this was the creepiest, most horribly paranormal thing I've ever encountered. I hope never to encounter anything like it again. The house I grew up is about 200 years old, perhaps older. My mom still lives in it. When I was younger, I started seeing cats that weren't really there. They'd rub up against my leg and run off. We didn't have any cats and it creeped me out, but at the same time, now that it doesn't happen anymore, I sort of miss it. Now the upstairs is a little weird in layout terms. You go up the stairs, at the top are two doors, one goes into my sister's room, and the other into my mom's. You have to go through my mom's room to get to mine. I believe it was a nursery when it was first built. When I was in 4th grade, my sister and I were getting ready to go to school. My mom was at work, and since my sister went to the middle school, she left a little early to catch the school bus. I'd always be home alone for about 10 minutes before I left. My sister and I were both in my room. She was getting ready to leave to get on the bus, and I turned towards my door, looking into my mom's room, and saw a floating figure in a dark brown cloak. Its head and face were concealed in a hood. It didn't seem too tall and was floating a good 2 or 3 feet off the ground. It just hovered there, didn't move. I screamed at the top of my lungs and turned towards my sister and turned back, and it was gone. I told my sister what I saw, and I was so scared, I was crying. She had to leave or she was going to miss the school bus, and I begged her not to. I was so scared. I eventually went with her to the bus stop and just waited for my school to start. This gives me chills just typing this out. My mom has also heard footsteps coming up the stairs several times. After I saw this figure, the cats quit appearing, and I haven't had any other experiences since, but my mom's house still creeps the hell out of me. I told my dad this story a few years ago, and he said when he was a kid, he went into his kitchen to get a drink after waking up late and saw 2 figures like what I described. TLDR, my mom's house is really old, and I saw ghost cats and a floating cloaked figure. My dad saw 2 similar figures as a kid as well. In the summer of 2007, on our way back from California, we were driving across rural Nevada in the middle of the night with my boyfriend and sister. My sister was asleep, my boyfriend was driving. Now rural Nevada is a creepy enough place as it is, a lot of abandoned and run-down places, half ghost towns. At one point, we even explored an abandoned motel, lots of mattresses with the stuffing ripped out, possessions scattered all over the floors, including wallets and expired prescription medication. Really cool, really creepy stuff. Anyway, so we were driving in the middle of the night, a little 2-lane state highway. And in the desert, it's not that uncommon to see nothing but the stars and whatever is right in front of your car. It gets dark, really dark. That's how it was this night. And this was somewhere between 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., so completely dead of night conditions. No houses anywhere nearby, no businesses, nothing. No lights. Suddenly we pass a man walking on the side of the road. We don't see him for very long, but enough to see that he's dressed kind of like a timeless red-blooded working man, checked shirt, jeans and a wide-brimmed hat of some kind. He could have been from 1890 or 2007, it's hard to say. And of course, at night, headlights bleach the color of everything, so it's hard to say what color his shirt or anything was. Honestly, in my mind, I remember it as sort of grayscale. Not the creepy glowing ghost blue, just gray. But that's probably because it was at night and we saw it by headlight. He's not carrying anything, not a light, not anything that indicates that he's there for any purpose. Just walking. We don't see any car, there's no towns or houses nearby that we can see, it's just desert. There haven't even been any other cars or intersecting roads for a long time. He's in our headlights for as long as anything is, probably 30 seconds or so. He doesn't react at all. Doesn't flag us down, or wave to us or even look in our direction. He just keeps calmly walking, alone and empty-handed at the side of the road. Both myself and my boyfriend react eloquently, Something along the lines of what the ever-loving "what did we just see?" I stare out the back window, expecting to see a light blink on, or something. But nothing happens. We consider turning around to see if he needs help, but wouldn't he have waved to us if he needed help? Also, we are both creeped the hell out because this is rural Nevada in the middle of the night, and what did we just see? Now, I'm a pretty sane person. I look for rational explanations. I'm the type of person who, upon seeing UFO videos, will Google plus hoax. Not to say there aren't plenty of things out there that are pretty weird and still beyond complete explanation, bits of quantum physics, for example. But a dude walking down the road should not be beyond explanation. I mean, okay, maybe he was just a hiker out for a solitary night jaunt in the desert. But wouldn't have he at least acknowledged our car in some way? I'm not going to say I totally saw a ghost, but I got unsettled just thinking about this. When I was in middle school, my next door neighbor / best friend's great-grandmother died. She died in the house, in her bed. Before she died, she would call me bitch, and pull my hair, and say all sorts of craziness in German. So about a month after her death, my best friend is now sleeping in her bedroom, using her furniture, even sleeping in the sheets she died in. This particular sleepover night, I happened to fall asleep in her living room. Side note, this home is over 100 years old, and has an odd layout with many rooms. I woke up in a sweat, very thirsty at about 3 a.m. The house was dark. I immediately felt like someone was watching me. I start turning on and off lights as I enter and leave rooms on my way to the kitchen. While in the kitchen, I grab some orange juice. While I am drinking the juice, I can feel someone watching me from the hallway to the living room. By this time I am freaked out. I slam the door to the fridge, shut the light, and run to my friend's bedroom. I distinctly remember pulling her door all the way closed because I was so freaked. I jump into my friend's bed. She is sleeping soundly. Her room is softly lit, unlike the rest of the house, by an outside light. A few moments after I pull the covers up to my chin and get my bearings, her bedroom door slowly starts to creak open. There are footsteps that walk into the room, and on into her bathroom, which is located at the foot of the bed. I am watching wide-eyed as this happens, and see nothing. The footsteps are heavy, and padded. As they enter the bathroom, things start flying off the vanity and bathtub. One after another, shampoo, brushes, makeup is all flying into the tub and then the sink. By this time I am desperately trying to wake my best friend. I am basically screaming at her, with no response. Pulling on her, bouncing her into the bed so hard that she is catching air, with no response. The footsteps begin to walk back into the bedroom. I pull the covers over my face while I dig my fingernails into my friend's arm. The footsteps slowly walk into the room, up to the bed, around the bed to my side. Out of nowhere, hands are clamped onto my ankles and my whole body is paralyzed for a moment. Full body sweat, heart pounding so loud I can't believe my friend isn't awake. It seemed like forever, but was really a few moments, and the hands let go. As soon as the hands were gone, my friend woke up. She had no idea what had happened, had heard none of it. Scariest sleepover ever.